Well, welcome everyone tonight again. Thank you for all being here. So again, we welcome Father Jeff Kemper from the Archdiocese of Cincinnati. Mount St. Mary's for a number of years as dean and a professor, and spent a lot of time teaching about liturgy. And actually was the pastor of both the last church in the Archdiocese.
Yes, which will be the second last church when you're done.
Yeah, and somebody commented that they watched the live stream, but they didn't catch the question and answer period. So I'm going to walk around with the microphone when we do the question and answer, just so that people who want to watch on live stream can kind of hear what's going to be conversed.
Great. Well, let's start with a prayer. Almighty God, source of all goodness and life, you have saved us and made us your children by the death and resurrection of your Son, and established us as the temple in the world of your presence and the power of the Spirit. We ask your grace upon us, your wisdom, a sense of discipline, a sense of creativity, a sense of goodness and light, that we may build a church worthy of your honor and which helps all people to be drawn closer to you. We ask you to give us the grace to do this job in charity, to work through the complicated process that we often will face in little things, probably not so much as in the bigger things. And we ask that in the end, we may continue to be a light in this part of the county, in this part of our country and our world, through Christ our Lord. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. I was going to ask, before we start this session, for people who were here last week, did you have any questions or anything from last week? All right. That means I was either very clear, or you're like, oh no, I don't want to get him going on a question because he just doesn't shut up. So I'm glad we're here. As we call this part two, and I call it When Living Stones Build, because the title of the book is Built of Living Stones, and it comes from that passage from St. Peter's first letter, where he says, you are living stones of the temple of the Lord. And so we who are the living stones that form the temple of the Lord now build the temple of stone for the church to be able to worship and to pray. And now this week I have a clicker, or whatever you want to call this, and I can probably screw this up as well as I did without one last week. Can you all see okay? So last week we left off with what were the things necessary in the sanctuary, and we talked about the altar, the ambo is the main things, and then the chair where the priest presider sits, often called the presider's chair. And then the final thing that they mention in there, which are not seen as of the importance of the other things, but accent or bring focus on, is number one, in the sanctuary there is to be a crucifix by the altar. Now when they say by the altar, they don't mean it has to be on the altar. In fact, they say if you put a crucifix on the altar that people can see, it sort of blocks what you can see happening at the altar. So they recommend that it could be on the wall, it could be hung from the ceiling, it could be the processional crucifix, which would need to be big enough for people to see, but also not so big that someone can't carry it in if you're going to use a processional cross. If the processional cross is not the main crucifix, so for example, here you have the crucifix on the wall, then after the processional cross is carried in, it's put out of sight so that there's one crucifix by the altar. And then candles by the altar. It says there should be between 2 and 6 candles. That's up to whatever you decide. And ideally, they are placed by the altar. If not, if they can't be placed by the altar, they can be placed on the altar. Now, were the candlesticks saved from the other church?
There were about 6 left, and then they might get 4 or 5 when they try to put back.
Okay. You know what you can do with those is, and I don't know, were they like floor candles or, if they're floor candles, that's fine. If not, there's ways to have a stand made to raise them up. One of the things about the candles on the altar that they say is it should not be that the altar is loaded with a bunch of stuff, so that the altar is always extremely special because it's the place of the making presence of the sacrifice of Christ, the table, the Eucharistic table, so candles by there. And so 2, 4, or 6 or whatever, and those could be increased by feast, 2 candles out normally or whatever. That's all for you all to decide in that. The candles should be real wax candles. They don't have to be, there's no limit on the wax, but it should be a candle, and it should not be a fake candle. One of the things is that in church, we don't try to present, everything should represent the truth of what it is, and so that's the point of saying not fake candles. The Paschal candle, obviously, is an important candle, and I put it in here because we're going to segue right into the baptistry. But the Paschal candle, it says, reminds us that it is the light of Christ which overcame death. Christ is, and so it should be in proportion to the size of the church. Now, normally the Paschal candle does not get moved around much in a ritual way other than it's carried in. So it has to be carryable into church, and yet it should also be in proportion to the size of the church, so that if you have a big church, you don't have some spindly little candle there. But that's all for you to decide, and that would require a stand for that candle. So hopefully that was saved and could be used too. So anyhow, those are the points on that. Now we'll move into baptism, the baptistry. And there we go. This, the baptistry, it mentions in the guidelines, the sacraments of initiation require a prominent space for celebration, and the theological connection of the font to the altar should be manifest in position, in relationship of position to the font and the altar and the type of material used. Now, what does that mean? First of all, in the old days, if we would go back to before Vatican II, usually a church had a baptismal font in the back of church, often in a little area off to the side, sort of a room dedicated to that. And that idea of it in the back of the church goes back to ancient times of the church coming into church. There was a font in the area where you entered to symbolize that as you come into the building, you were reminded that we come into the life of Christ. And so the baptistries would be there. If you go to Europe, there's baptistries that would have cost more than to build a whole new church in these glorious places. But the point is that the baptismal font should be someplace close to the main entrance of the church to symbolize that. We're also going to find that that can be significant in relationship to funerals. The exact location of that comes down to what is looked at in the whole thing. Is it in the gathering area itself? Is it inside the church past that gathering area where the people gather together? This is just something you get as a benefit, like the Jinsu knives with the bamboo steamer. But one of the problems I find in church, it's a very pragmatic problem, of the baptistry in the gathering area, is that it often, people begin to set things down on the font, and it's hard to keep that area warm enough in the winter for, not that it won't be warm enough, but that the cold air of people coming in and out. So those are just some things to consider there with that. The theological concept, a connection between the font and the altar, and that is that baptism in the early church, and even to this day for adults, the order of the sacraments of initiation are baptism, confirmation, and Eucharist. We are born and brought forward to be fed and strengthened in the Spirit. So they're seen as a connection between those. Now, how that connection comes about could be in the position of the font down the center aisle or whatever with that. It could also be in materials that are used that connect those two, that people look and say, oh, the font is made out of whatever in here. In this picture, which this is not saying this is what your font should look like, but it's the only picture I had of a font, the font is made of some kind of marble, granite, I don't know. I could never keep straight what was the difference between marble and granite, but they did. And then the altar top here, which you can't see very well, it all looks like it's the same thing, but it's that black granite as well, so to hold that together. One of the things we find when we look at this is that it should be large enough for so we're talking here about the baptistry area. So there's an area. It does not have to be a defined area as a room. It doesn't need to be a defined area as marked off, but it is meant to be big enough for people to gather around it. So if you're having baptisms on Sunday, families should be able to gather around it. Obviously, if you're doing baptisms at Mass, you aren't going to have a room big enough for everyone to gather around, but people in the pews can turn and see the font and experience baptism, see the baptism taking place. The font is the place of rebirth into the life of Christ. It's often referred to as the womb, the tomb, and the womb of the church. That plays well in English because our words rhyme. In other languages it doesn't. But nonetheless, in tradition, the font has been seen as the tomb in the sense that we go down into the water in death to sin, to rise from the water to new life in Christ. The connection of burial and rising, the connection with the flood of Noah, and evil is killed off and new life is generated again. It's also a symbol of cleansing from sin. What's important to remember in baptism is that in it, Christ comes to live in us and dwell in us. And so that saying from St. Paul, it is not I who live, but Christ who lives in me. That Christ has come to live in me. And now our lives are meant to be lived surrendering to Christ within us to receive and grow even stronger in the new life of grace as we let the old life of sin die in that way. We find, as I mentioned, the sacraments of initiation, baptism, confirmation, and Eucharist, so the connection there with that. And then choosing the design for the font. So these are, I think it's 6 points that they outline. The first two I put together because they sort of almost repeated themselves. The size of the font and the water capacity should be large enough to hold an adult. That assumes baptism by immersion. Now, we are not so much used to baptism by immersion in the Catholic tradition, but what is interesting is why we got away from it and where we find it mentioned before Vatican II. We got away from it because as Christianity spread up north and whole communities became Christian, who was left to baptize infants? And so fonts were actually big enough, they were like a pedestal font, big enough that a baby could be put in and lifted out of the water. When a baby's immersed, you don't hold them by the feet and dunk them, but you hold them by the head and put them in except for the face. And over time, because of the coldness, now realize back then they didn't know a germ from anything, so it wasn't a matter of hygiene, but it was cold, and so immersion gave way to the pouring of water as a way of baptism. Now, they did pour water early on in the church, and sometimes when people were baptized and they got into the font, the big fonts, more in Southern Europe where we had churches built at a time when not everyone was Christian, so you had adults come in. They got in, knelt down in the water, and water was poured over their head. But the point of it is that baptism and the reason for a baptismal font or pool is that the main symbol of baptism is dying and rising with Christ. That can seem very strange and very weird until you see it done and until the priest or the deacon does it and says, this is doable. So anyhow, I'm just pointing those things out to you with that. Choosing the design for the font, baptism is a sacrament of the whole church, and in particular of the local church. And what they mention that for is that it is not meant to be just shoved off in a corner. What often happened is with baptistries ceasing to be dedicated areas and being sort of places that would collect stuff, as churches became more in tune with, we have to have a restroom here, or we have to have a space for this or that, the baptistry often got taken for that, and the font would then be put anywhere you could find a place to put the font, or left in that area, and we stored a stepladder and a mop in the same area with that. And so the point is, it's not meant to be something that's just off out of the way, but something that the people can participate and be present at, as well as reminded as they come in. I want to say this. The church is not saying baptism must be done by immersion. It is saying that that option should be taken seriously in that. The other thing I said is I would tell you, actually in the rite that anyone here over, well, I'll just say anyone baptized before 1969 was baptized in, the rite of 1614 states immersion is there, but realizes that often that's not going to be possible in that situation. But just so, some people say, oh, now we're becoming like Baptists, Well, actually, Baptists became more like us. Choosing the design of the font. The location of the baptistry will determine how and how actively the entire liturgical assembly can participate in the rite. In other words, its location, how much space you have, and all of that makes a difference. That sort of goes back to number 4. What I'd like to say something about the font here is there's many different designs of fonts. The one we saw in that picture is an octagonal shape, and that's an ancient shape of baptismal fonts. And the idea of 8 sides, 7 is the number in Jewish tradition of the fullness of something complete. God rested on the 7th day because the creation of the world was complete. For Christians, they saw it as we have gone through, we're beyond the completion of the natural world, and so we're in a new time, the time of the kingdom. And so it was 8 became the symbol of that new time. You might find in some places you read Sunday is the first day, Sunday is the 8th day. Well, which is it, the first day or the 8th day? Well, that 8th day was in relationship to creation, and we're in a new way of being. First day of the week, 8th day. I always say, don't get going on math in the Catholic Church, because you have one God, 3 persons in one God, each of them is God, that all that is there. So we find that with the font. The relationship of baptism to the other sacraments recommends that the baptistry visually symbolizes that relationship. In other words, once again, that sense of the baptistry in a place where when the other sacraments are celebrated, people pass by it in that way. All of this, remember, are principles. And in building, I'm not saying at all don't follow these, because I really believe strongly that the baptismal font makes a big difference in people's understanding of the life of the church and their life. Because when they come in, instead of having little fonts at the door, they dip their hands in the baptismal font and are reminded that this is how we came to life. And we came to life through the death and resurrection of Jesus. But so that the other sacraments celebrate it. For example, we're going to find in the rite of funerals, where it's so obvious that we sprinkle the body with holy water, and the words are about baptism. On the day of their baptism, Fred died with Christ and rose with him to new life. May he now share in everlasting life. When that water's drawn from the font, that makes a difference in that way. And then the OCIA, which we used to call the RCIA, but the new translation goes to the original name, order of Christian initiation, culminates at the Easter Vigil. And so it says there should be places where the newly baptized can dress. In other words, we need places for that if it's by immersion. That does not mean that you have to have dedicated rooms that you say, oh, that's only for, somebody getting dressed after baptism. But you have to say, where would they go to do that? Most churches, if they have like a sacristy in the back and a meeting room, they're blocked off, and it works well for that night. But that's something you want to consider with that. Then the place of the sacred oils. So it's called an ambry or a repository. And I don't know if you have one out here in the back. So it's a place where the sacred oils are stored and displayed, once again as a reminder that through the grace of God coming to us through the act of anointing. Anointing has always been associated in the Jewish tradition from the time of a king is for the anointing of priests, prophets, and kings. And so we who are baptized are anointed with the oil of catechumen before baptism as a sign of being strengthened. And oil is a sign of strength and healing. To be strengthened, to learn the message. We're anointed with chrism at baptism and at confirmation to remind us that we share in the priesthood, the kingship, the serving kingship of Jesus Christ in his prophetic role. And we're sealed with the Spirit with that. And we're anointed at the sacrament of the sick for healing. And so those oils should be displayed, and it can be displayed either in the sanctuary or someplace by the font. But the place where they're displayed needs to be a place that the oils can be securely displayed. In other words, you wouldn't just have open shelves and put the oils on them, or something where someone could come in and easily take them. So usually it's some kind of case, and it could be a recess into the wall, or it could be a case itself firmly attached to the wall, and it would lock in a way with that. And it says it should be dignified and safe. Sometimes you think, well, why do you have to mention dignified? We just assume that. I remember when I was helping Archbishop Pilarczyk at that time. It was Bishop Pilarczyk, and I was a deacon in the seminary. And we went out for confirmation, and communion under both kinds had just started. And it was very clear in the guidelines. It said, the vessels are to be worthy and dignified vessels. And we went to this place, and they had tumblers that had wheat painted on them that they got. At that time, there was Gold Circle stores. I don't know if you had them up here. But they were like Kmart in that. And Archbishop Pilarczyk was very patient but clear that that is not what was intended. So that's why they always mention the thing of dignity with those and safe. The other thing is, some churches buy vessels to hold the oil, to store the oil, and they're huge, and you don't need that much oil. Some places bought ones that are like this big. It would hold a quart of oil. Well, unless you're changing the oil in cars, you aren't going to need a quart of holy oil for that year. Cathedrals obviously have to have big ones, but to be aware of that, so with the holy oil. Then, before we do that, any questions on baptism or font or anything like that? Comments? All right. Then let's look now at the reservation of the Eucharist. The Eucharist, so that we understand why we reserve the Eucharist, is the Eucharist in the early church was reserved for the purpose of communion for the dying. That's why they reserved the Eucharist. And of course, in the early church, they didn't necessarily have a church building. There were some church buildings as early as the late 100s ADs in places that had sort of established a good Christian context, in a room of a house or a building was dedicated. But that was pretty rare. But the Eucharist was reserved, and so it wouldn't have been reserved in a church like we reserve it in a church today. But the priest or the bishop would have kept Eucharist to take to the dying. And because they would take it to the dying, it would also be taken to those who couldn't make it to Mass. And that might be people who were sick. It might be people who were unable to get to church. Remember, there was slavery around, and Christianity appealed to slaves. And so they could not just say, well, I'm leaving for church now. And the imprisoned, those who were imprisoned, especially for the faith, the Eucharist would be taken to. Over time, people said, as churches came to be, and there was a place to reserve the Eucharist, which was originally in the sacristy, the place where you get ready for Mass and all of that. It was stored in a cabinet there, and people came to realize that there's a benefit to praying before the Eucharist. What I mean by benefit is not that if you pray before the Eucharist, God hears your prayer faster than if you didn't, but the sense of it draws us into the life of Christ. So prayer and adoration before the Eucharist became a venerable practice. And so those are all the things that we look at when we look at reserving the Eucharist. One of the things that we look at with that is the church is very strict on where the Eucharist is reserved, in the sense of you can't just say, well, I'm going to take it home and put it in a little jewelry box on my dresser and I can pray before it. No, it has to be in the protected custody of the church in that way. And so it's not like you can just say, oh, we'll put it anywhere. And because it's Christ himself, it needs to be a place of reverence. The time of prayer before the Eucharist is to help us to foster a greater and deeper participation in the Mass. Now, that's not necessarily a one-to-one correspondence. I pray before the Eucharist. Now when I go to Mass, I automatically see this or that. But it's always related back to the Eucharistic action. And the Eucharistic action that we do is not simply to get communion on the altar and therefore for us to receive communion. It's to remember the dying and rising of Christ, which has saved us, and that we are drawn into it. We are fed into the dying and rising of Jesus by receiving Christ himself. So Jesus Christ, who we receive in the Eucharist, is completely and fully present, not just in the sense of, well, his body's there, he's God, he's there, but his whole action for our salvation. The pre-existent Christ who existed before there was ever anything else, in union with the Father, the Son of God. The incarnate Christ, born, who lived like us in all things but sin. The crucified Christ, who suffered at the hands of sinners and died. And the risen Christ is present. All of that is one Christ. And that's when Christ is present in the Eucharist, we mean he is there for that, in all those dimensions. And so it's meant to bring us into a deeper appreciation of Mass and also a deeper love of God and charity towards our neighbor. There are people who, you know, they'll pray before the Eucharist all day, but they'll go out and treat people like they're dirt. But there's other people who pray before the Eucharist for great hours and go out and do great care and concern for other people. So it's not one or the other. It's that we have to incorporate those two together. And so when we look at that reservation of the Eucharist, it's meant to bring that about. And the tabernacle. There should be only one tabernacle in church. Now, the exception to that is churches which were built in olden days, and often there would be multiple altars, and often they had tabernacles with them. But the Eucharist wasn't reserved in all those tabernacles. Often those tabernacles sat empty on the side altars. And the side altars for Mass were there because when there were plenty priests did not concelebrate at that time. They would say their own Mass every day. And when I was in high school at St. X in Cincinnati, there was the big chapel, and it held like 300 people. And then there was a hallway, and down that hallway were 10 altars lined up. And the priests who weren't the celebrant that day at Mass would often say Mass at the same time in these little things. And I would go and serve for them. I hate to say the reason I went and served for them was because we were out 20 minutes earlier if you served for one priest, and you got to lunch early. I hope I've changed. So anyhow, the tabernacles, there should only be one in church. It should be solid, unmovable, opaque. In other words, you cannot see into it through it shouldn't be made of glass or something like that. And it should be securely locked, not with some little flip thing, but that no one can take the Eucharist. No one can steal the Eucharist, and that becomes important with that. And then it says that it can be placed on a pillar, which I spelled pillar wrong, or stand or embedded in one of the walls. It is, and then I have that solid immovable thing again. In other words, it should not be on a huge altar, except if you had an old church of which removing that altar would destroy the context of it. And so it's not, it should be on something, and the size of that should be big enough that when you go to the tabernacle, there's room to take the ciborium out, which is the container holding the host, and if you have to fill pyxes or patens or whatever, you can do that, but it should not be a huge place with that. The iconography, we know what icons are from computers, which are different than icons in religion, which are painted pictures. And when we use the term iconography, we don't mean necessarily the Greek Orthodox type looking pictures, but images around the tabernacle should be drawn from Eucharistic, either symbolism, or it could be a picture of the Last Supper. It could be those kind of things, but it shouldn't be just a lot of other stuff around there, like, oh, here's a collection for all our different devotional things, so that the tabernacle remains, the Lord remains, is seen as not equal to anything else in the church. By the tabernacle should be a special oil lamp or candle that burns continuously near the tabernacle as an indication of Christ's presence. So usually that's not always, it does not have to be a red candle, but most places have a red glass container with a candle in. It can be an oil lamp or a candle that burns continuously as an indication of Christ's presence. And then, of course, the behavior around that tabernacle should be of the utmost reverence and silence. The location of the tabernacle should be in a part of the church that is distinguished, conspicuous, visible, obviously visible, beautifully decorated, and suitable for prayer. Now, this is where you get down to, well, where is that and how should that be? And so we look and we see that the bishop is the final determiner of where the tabernacle is located. The bishop is the final determiner. And so when your plans are made, the bishop will have a say on what you do. Now, this is what I know about what the bishop says in an informal discussion with him. He said he believes it should be those things conspicuous, but it does not necessarily need to be exactly on the center axis. In other words, it doesn't need to necessarily be right behind the altar. It could be sort of off to the sides, but not far off where you wouldn't know and immediately know it's there. So in the guidelines it says it can be in the sanctuary apart from the altar of celebration. In other words, it's very clear, it should not be on the altar of celebration. and but it could be behind it, it could be towards the side, or whatever with that. Or it can be in a chapel suitable for private adoration and organically connected to the church and readily visible to the faithful. So probably it would be the type of thing, sort of as you have it over there, it could be in that kind of fashion. Obviously, this church was built before the changes had occurred, and so that probably would not be seen as optimal exactly how it is there, but that would be something that you can look at with that. In relationship to that, what we see is the tabernacle, well, I just put in there, is not to be located on the altar on which the Mass is celebrated. If in the sanctuary, it should not draw attention away from the Eucharistic celebration or its components. Yet at the same time, it needs to allow for a focus on the tabernacle outside of Mass. Now you might say, well, which one is it? Well, a lot is going to depend on the whole layout of the area. The reason it doesn't focus on the action, it does not hold priority over the action of the Mass. Some people would say, well, that's Christ there, and we're just celebrating Mass, is because who is it who leads the assembly in Mass? To the eyes, it is a human person, a priest. But to the eyes of faith, it is Christ leading us in that prayer. Christ is the great high priest, and all our prayers are brought before him and presented to the Father. He is active in it. So what we're saying is that the Eucharistic action from which the Eucharistic elements come is the prime action of the church. Certainly not the only action of the church, but it's the action that leads us then to be able to do all other things. So the tabernacle should not be the focus at that point. Yet, when people are in the church for prayer or adoration, if it's in the sanctuary, it should be something visible and have a point of reference and importance to it. There's a number of ways, as they say, considerations should be given to how you use distance, lighting, and other architectural designs to meet that need. So in some churches, they have it that when Mass is ready to begin, the lighting focuses on the altar, the ambo, the chair, and it becomes dimmer in the back, you know. In other places, it's by distance. It can be by a number of other ways. So when you look at these, don't think of them as simply yes or no. Think of them in terms of what are options, what are ways in which we deal with these things. Too often, we become locked in the black and white. It has to be this way or it can't be this way, when there's ways to look and say, how do we do that? And hopefully, your architect will be good with that, and anyone who's a liturgical consultant or whatever with that. There should be a sufficient distance between the tabernacle and the altar. So it shouldn't be that, it's like 5 feet between the altar and the tabernacle, you know. Now, we often see that in older churches, which we still use because that's how they were built. But in a new church, you find that there's space. And once again, that idea of space can make a difference in that. It doesn't mean it needs to be miles either. Once again, how you take all those elements, lighting, distance, and architectural devices makes the difference in what you do there. Boy, I got that slide in there 8 million times. You know why? Because I don't know really how to do this program. So what I do is make duplicates and then erase the lines and put in new things. And obviously, I left those in, and I'm a terrible proofreader. If it's in a separate chapel, there should be adequate seating and kneelers. So if you're going to say, we're going to have that in a separate, we're calling it a chapel, separate room, separate chapel, there should be enough places that people can come and pray and not be and not sort of have to just sort of sit in a corner or something like that. And it should be obviously reverent. And it should allow easy access for people in wheelchairs or with disabilities, whatever kinds of things that could come up there. So obviously, if it's a raised up, it's going to have a ramp, all those kind of things that we look at with those matters. Often in a chapel, it can be that it might be pews, it might be chairs and kneelers. There can be a number of ways to do that. The thing with chairs and kneelers in that situation is it allows for rearrangement if you need to get more in there or not. But you obviously need a big enough space to begin with it. So a thing to look at is what was our Eucharistic adoration practice. Now, we're not talking about exposition, which would be on the altar at church, but people coming in on their own to pray. What amount of space do we need, and what do we need to look at in terms of for the future with that? I just want to show you this. This is St. John's in Harrison, and the way we dealt with the issue was at St. John's, the old convent, when the sisters were still there, they had their chapel, they had an outside door put into their chapel, and then it became a chapel where anyone could come 24 hours a day to pray before the Eucharist. Obviously, the door from the convent into the chapel had a lock on it. But people could come 24 hours a day and pray. It was right on the street in Harrison, and so people could pray. So that was a big value for them, that accessibility to church. So when we were looking at this, and Archbishop Schnurr said, I want the tabernacle on the center axis. He wanted it on the center axis. But he said, I like the idea of it being also in a place where people can come for adoration. Now, another benefit to this is that, so what we did at St. John's was built, and then this here, oh, you think I never walked up a step, and I'm not even drinking. So these are doors here, and they're glass and sort of, not frosted, they're beveled, and then this is the Eucharist here, and that glass is clear. So the chapel is there behind, and the Eucharist is reserved here. So if you're in church, you can pray before the Eucharist, or you can be in the chapel at any time to pray before the Eucharist. With the lighting for Mass and such, if people come in, they just know, if there's Mass going on, they know to stay towards the sides, and people don't really notice people there. But that worked out well for us, and the people appreciate it. One of the things, you probably don't have to worry about this up here, but one time in the old chapel, someone came in at 3 in the morning and all of a sudden saw this hand fall out from behind the altar, because it was on the tabernacle was on the old altar from there. And it was like quite disturbing at 3 in the morning. And it was a homeless guy who was sleeping in there. And so with the new church, because it's out in a field and that, the door into the chapel, which is just behind the wall here, is where they would come in. There's a combination lock, and anyone who wanted could get that combination, but it would keep, strangers from being there. Of course, then you know who's a weirdo in your parish sleeping behind the tabernacle if they have the combination to it. But anyhow, that's just an example of that. I'm not saying that's the way it should be done, but that is an example of that. And it also allowed easy access to take the Eucharist back to the tabernacle after Mass. Those doors were there. The location of the tabernacle, in regard to if you have continuous adoration, I should say continuous exposition. And what we mean by continuous exposition is the host in a monstrance on the altar. Then it says you should have a separate place, because you would never have, I'm hitting that thing. You should never have the Eucharist exposed while Mass is going on. And so then it says you would need that separate space for that. Now let's look at the issue of the place for pastoral musicians. Music is intrinsic to the liturgy. If we're old enough, we might remember low Mass and high Mass and think of music as sort of icing on the cake. You know, you used to be able to get a low Mass for $2 and a high Mass for $5. And that is gone away, and especially under Pope Benedict. But also in the early documents, it said music is part of the Mass, because music lifts the soul. Even if we don't think of it as lifting the soul, music tends to unify. What do soldiers do when they march and drill? They have that musical cadence to it. I don't know if you know the story of Unsinkable Molly Brown, which was a movie, but it was also based on a true story of Molly Brown, who was sort of this wacky lady, but was on the Titanic, and they're in the lifeboat, and everyone was just dazed. They didn't know what to do, and so she got them singing, and by getting them singing, they could begin to get things together for themselves in that way. Singing is a therapy, music therapy. I don't know if you've ever heard of that. When I first heard of that, I thought, what the heck? But music can express for people feelings and emotions that they can't put into words. And so they can work through something that is beyond words. And as St. Augustine says, music lifts the spirit. He who sings prays twice, he said. And so music is considered a highly symbolic act because it expresses things that are beyond simply what we can put in our mind. And so it supports the congregation, joins us together. It highlights significant parts of the Mass, and it helps set the tone for the liturgy. The Advent hymns are different than hymns we sung 3 weeks ago, not simply in word, but often in the kind of music involved in those things. And so music is not sort of a secondary thought with that. The ministry of the music director, cantors, choirs, and instrumentalists enrich the liturgy. In other words, they are true ministers in the context of the Eucharist. They aren't performers. They're there to help us be drawn into play. And they're also part of the assembly, which means they should not be necessarily divided away from the assembly, or where they can't see or participate in the action of the Mass. The place for the pastoral musician, it should be able to facilitate the leading of the music. So obviously, musicians need eye contact with the other musicians, and especially with the director, whoever that is. It might be the organist, or it might be a separate choir director, whatever. And visible to the assembly, because the assembly will pick up cues. Now, it doesn't mean that they're center focus, but that they can pick up cues from that. And in connection to the instruments too, so that it's quite hard if you have a choir up in an organ up in the loft and the cantors down here, they will say, you know, it's sort of harder to be ready to go with that distance, and maybe part of that is psychological, but nonetheless, than if the person is relatively close, you know. And so that's what we mean in connection with the instruments. If the musicians are located near the sanctuary, it doesn't say they have to be. They should not distract from the action in the sanctuary. When I was at St. John's in the old church, it wasn't as wide as this church. It was deeper, but it wasn't as wide. And this sanctuary was very small, and the choir loft was needed to put people in. And so they had this little area where a side altar was, and they'd be cramped there. And so you'd be reading the gospel, and I'm not kidding, somebody right here is trying to get their music ready for the responsorial psalm. That did not work. And so you don't want that kind of distraction. And their purpose is not simply to be visible for the sake of visibility, but for them to be able to lead music. In the sense of that, I'm going to just show you something that worked well at St. John's. I'm not saying St. John's is the church to be, but it is my baby. No. But it's something that worked out well, and that is, and you can't really see it as well here, but the musicians are here. The musicians are here. There's a stand. All of this looks like shades of brown, but there's a stand that the cantor stands at to lead hymns and things like that. And so they have easy eye contact with the organist and other people, and it works well, and it's not distracting. So those are all things to be worked out, but I can really appreciate when people say it seems distracting, but you can't just have all your music absolutely. Music often has to be unfolded and all of that, so it's not like they're just clowning around there with that. And then, so that's with that. The rite of penance. For the rite of penance, the reconciliation room, or what we sometimes call a chapel, people tend to use the word chapel because using reconciliation room often gives people the idea, oh, it's a room, we can store stuff in it, you know. I remember helping out at a parish one weekend when I was on, the seminary faculty. In the reconciliation room I went in, and there was an ironing board, a broom, an iron, and all this stuff, and 2 chairs, you know. Another parish, it was the usher's room. And so I was hearing first confessions. It was on a Saturday, and a very diligent usher got there before we were finished, and he just sort of comes in and goes, hi, and tips toes past me and this kid, and that. It should be a room dedicated. It should have what we call a fixed screen or a grill for anonymous confession. That, when it says fixed, I don't think it needs to be clamped to the floor, but it shouldn't be something that looks like, oh, we forgot this. It should be a piece of furniture that is significant, you know, and allows for anonymous confession. There should also be the opportunity for face-to-face confessions given as well. And it should be accessible for people with handicaps. I can't remember I put this, yes. It should reflect the sacred nature of the sacrament. So once again, the size of the room should be in proportion to things. And what I find is often, and this is a problem at St. John's, the room is way too big for what we needed, you know. But this is one of the problems that architects have, is finding out what size in this. And I find that's more of a problem in new churches than it becoming a junk collecting place. But the sacred nature of the sacrament. The lighting, iconography, and furnishing should reflect the worthiness of the sacrament. In other words, it's not like, go get 2 folding chairs out of the multi-purpose room and throw an old pad on the floor for someone to kneel on. So you want to look at it and say, how do we make this a place that is inviting, that is a place where people feel the forgiving nature of God? Once again, the iconography, all those kind of things used. The other thing is soundproofing. More churches are built, and I believe, because I know I did, I said, I want that confessional soundproofed. And it got built, and you might as well just be in any room. And so we had to use, places use these sound machines, you know, like for people when they try to get to sleep. Well, that's just a pain in the butt for people to have to sit out there and listen to that. Pain in the butt is not a theological term. But it's the soundproofing. So I urge you to check on that, to say, I want to see, because they said, oh, we forgot about that. Well, then, you know, the church is finished when we realize that. And so those are things to consider. Whether you have one or a number of them, I think depends on what you have for priests available and things like that. And the other thing might be that you look at and say, well, we have a lot of confessions. We have more than one priest at a time. It might be that you say, we have a room dedicated to that and another room that will pass for that without being just a closet, you know. It might be used for something else, but with consideration for use in the sacrament in that way. Any questions on the tabernacle? I forgot to ask any questions on the tabernacle, comments on the tabernacle or the place for reconciliation. Once again, the place should be visible. It doesn't need at all the predominance of where the Eucharist is reserved, but it should be a place that when people come into church, they would know where to find it. That might be with a sign that says the reconciliation room is here or there. And then the rite of marriage. If the practice is that the couple sits in the sanctuary, there should be adequate space for that couple to fit in so they aren't having to like climb over each other to get there. That's totally up to you. I mean, those are your decisions for that. But you would want to make sure then that there is a space for the couple to sit, but also to kneel, you know, without impinging on the main furnishings of the sanctuary. And then there's other considerations you might look at in terms of local customs that places have and what goes on. You know, sort of like taking flowers to the statue of Mary and things like that. Now, that wouldn't mean that in the design of church you're going to say, well, where we put the Mary statue is solely based on what we do at weddings, but you want to look at that. And it doesn't mean that people can't walk a distance to go there. I do have to tell you this story. At St. Columban's, the musician's name is Mary Bellman. And this couple said they wanted to take flowers to Mary. So it's at the end of Mass, and the priest says, take the flowers to Mary. And they walk over to the organ. And he goes, no, the statue of Mary. So for weeks when I help out there, I would put a flower on the organ for, you know. And so whatever customs are there. An aisle, once again, this is the thing, we're coming past the font, and this can be done in catechesis and things like that. Coming past the font reminds them that in baptism they were baptized and they're living out their baptismal commitment in married life. You know, everyone lives out their baptismal commitment. Some people in married life, a few people in religious life or ordination, some people in single life, but we all our vocations are connected back to our calling from baptism. Funerals, the connection between baptism and eternal life, which we talked about before, at the rites of the doors of church and at the font. So you want to make sure that if you have your font in the back, there's ample room to get a casket around it and ample room to come down the aisle with pallbearers and a casket. You know, this church is great for that. In fact, you could have really heavy people be pallbearers in this church and still get a body down here. So that happens. And then especially up in the front, there should be room for a casket and for people to be able to come up to communion easily and return to their place. And so on that, I think I have put around the fontan entrance, easy movement of the casket for the family and mourners. And remember, the family is going to be gathered back there with them. And you don't want them standing out in the gathering space unless your font is out there. You want them inside. Sufficient for the casket and pallbearers, as well as the distribution for the aisle. So the front aisle needs to be big enough. The main aisle needs to be big enough. It could be that there's cut out like here in the pews that allow for that. One of the reasons in older churches that probably didn't take place is because until like really in 1910, people did not go to communion very often. And so they didn't really worry about people coming up for communion. There's a whole story of funerals in Cincinnati, and Archbishop Purcell saying every funeral had to be completed by 10 o'clock in the morning because the Irish and the Germans would come drunk later in the day after the wake. So there's all these wonderful stories that don't make it into devotional histories. Popular devotions. So popular devotions nurture the spirit of prayer, and they draw the faithful more deeply into the life of Christ. And no popular devotion is the devotion all Catholics should do. They're called popular because they're the devotion of the peoples. And so parishes can have special devotions that they have, or it can be looked at and said, these are the ones that we feel are part of our tradition here. But there should also be an openness to other devotions. As with any devotion, the purpose is to draw the faithful more deeply into the life of Christ. A situation that can arise with devotions is that everything has its pros and cons. Is sometimes devotions, even sacraments, become like magic things. If I pray this, I'm guaranteed this. If I do this, I'm guaranteed this. One time I found in the back of church a novena to St. Joseph, which if you did it for the 9 days, it has never been broken, and it began in 50 AD. So somehow I don't think that's true. 50 AD, a devotion, a novena, and the idea that if you do it, you definitely get it. We pray to be drawn into the life of Christ, and so devotion should lead us to a keener participation in the Eucharist and lead us in our lives to nourish what happened there. Sacred images, which go together with, I think, with devotions, is they create a sense of devotion and prayer. They reflect the deeper realities of faith for us. And they do it through art. And art is not necessarily simply something someone does and we automatically like it in the sense of religious art. Or the purpose of art for religion is not simply to do something that we find visually or orally, using music as art, attractive, we like it, we like the sound of it, or whatever, and therefore it's worthy. It's meant to be that it draws us more deeply into the realities of faith. Some church art is very what we call representative. It looks like it's a picture or a photo. I'm not going to say this right. It looks like a photo of an event, but if it's true art, it's going to also have about it a sense of communicating a sense of reverence. Other art can be highly symbolic and show things in symbolic or abstract ways. Each of us have our own preferences on what we like and what we don't like. But what we have to remember is in building a church and taking care of it, we aren't taking care of just ourselves. We aren't taking care of just what the committee, if we're on the committee, well, this is what the committee likes. We have to look and say, how does this work? The other thing we have to look at is to say, how does the art, and what I mean by that is the whole design, how is it welcoming to others, that they feel welcome? Now, that doesn't mean that you say, we have 5 Ethiopians in the parish, so now we have to have a Coptic piece of art, and we have 10 people from Mexico in the parish, we have to have Our Lady of Guadalupe, and everything represented in that way. But we look and we say, how does the church invite in? Because that's the purpose of a parish. A parish does not exist as the shelter of the saved and that we're taken care of in congruent faith. The purpose of a parish is the localized purpose of the church, which is to go out and proclaim the gospel and to draw people in. And we do that in the context of our everyday living. It's not that we all are going out as missionaries and in that way. But how we live our life, how we're nourished here, how we're strengthened here isn't just for our own salvation, but so that we can do that work of bringing it to others. So that's something just to consider when you look at the art you have in church. The other thing is, I think you might look, and I don't know how many statues and things you were able to save from your other church, but I don't think you need to look and say, we have to have all our art here when the church is finished. You know, it could be you do, but don't feel that, well, we got to have everything in place and, you know, all of that. And so, you know, there can be that, there's things that remind people that, and it can be a reminder, we got to pay this place off, so if you want something, you better give for it. At St. John's, we did not get a bell tower, which killed me. There's plans for it, but we didn't have the money for it. And it just killed me not to have a bell tower. But when people would say, I wish we had a bell tower, I'd say, well, when we pay off this part of the church, we can get a bell tower. So I haven't seen that a new one has been built yet, but they didn't always listen to me. Then the other point is the communion of saints, that the art reminds us. It might be a statue of a saint, or it might be something of the life of Christ, or a picture from the life of a saint. Those things draw us into that sense that we are not the church, and that, oh yeah, there's people who died and went to heaven. We're all the church together, you know. We're all the church together in that way. Now, sacred images, as I said, look at cultural traditions. There should be a restraint in the number and placement so that they encourage focus on the liturgical action. So and once again, this has to do with how it's placed and all of those things. But some places you go in and it just looks like your great-grandmother collected dolls, and you know, there's just 8,000 statues in a mishmash or pictures or whatever. So once again, how do they relate and encourage focus on the liturgical action? It says in the guidelines that some kind of representation of the patron of the parish should be in the church, or it might be outside the church. And then, as we mentioned, current piety. What are the things people like? So that brings us, actually, that brings us in plenty of time to questions or conversations. And so what I'd like you to do first, any questions right now? So I'm going to ask you to consider these two questions. Think about these for a minute or two. And then what I'd like you to do is just turn to people around you and ask, how has my understanding of what a church building is about changed from what we did here? And the reason for us looking at that is often we have information and we go, okay, I have this information, but to process that into words reinforces it. There was a thing on the radio the other day about scientists have found that using like some kind of little doll thing, it might be a rubber duck or something like that, and when the scientists are stuck, they talk to the duck or whatever they have and say, this is the problem, here's my problem, here's what I'm trying to figure out. And the verbalization of that can lead them to helpful resolution because they're putting it in words, you know. Now, I would think you could do that by talking to people too, but if a duck works, go for the duck. But so that's that. And then what are things I need to think about? And what I mean by that is it might be, that's a totally new idea, or I don't know if I agree with this. I just don't know if this is what I'm comfortable with. Because I think in that then we can look at that. So I ask you to let's take about 2 minutes just to think about those things, and then I'm going to ask you to turn to each other and All right, now if you just turn towards people around you, and what changed in my idea of what a church is about? Or what is something I need to think more about, or I just don't agree with, or whatever? Okay, why don't we just get back together, and anyone can raise any issues you want to raise, or if somebody from each group could say, hey, this was one of the things we talked about. So we can begin. Anybody, questions, points, insights? And we'll come around with a mic.
We're wondering if, is a choir loft being discouraged then?
Yes, choir lofts are discouraged, but not prohibited. But it wouldn't be that the choir would be up there in the back. It's encouraged at that choir because there needs to be the leadership of song from up front. So I think that would be, I mean, there's not a theological reason for it, but that would be a thing. The other thing is it tends to separate people from the being one body, but that, you know, that's, yes. Let me.
And it's got balcony in it.
Could you just start that again? Wait a minute. Oh, okay. I'll let you take care of this.
Our son attends Immaculate Heart of Mary Church in Cincinnati, and it has a balcony, and that seats people. However, though, there's a little bit of a feeling to me, it's a little bit more like a theater as opposed to
Right.
a sacred church.
Yeah. I have to say that church as it is now is not as it is when it was built. And if you look at it as it is now and think there's problems with it, you should have seen it when it was built. It was a mess. It was one of the things that made Archbishop Bernardine, one of the churches that made Archbishop Bernardine establish an environment and art committee that had to approve plans because it was such a mess. So what they've done now, I mean, I think they've done the best they can with that. But yes, it gives that sense of, it's sort of like a theater. We're up there watching a distance, communion. It's a big loft. And so, yeah, that creates an issue. I don't know if I'm answering, or if, yeah. I don't know. Are you guys landlocked? Are you landlocked?
Is going to do a lot of studies about what's available. The cemetery is right behind, so that's an issue. You know, it's a sacred space, so you don't want to disrupt that. So there's wider. They're also doing some testing, not to go out and say we're moving it, but they're testing across the street, just see what's out there. But there was a school there, so they're doing boring samples to find out what's there. So we look at different options, we know what we're dealing with.
It could be that you end up saying, for the space we're in, we might be limited and have to do that. But it's certainly not an ideal way to respond to the space issue.
At St. John, at your former parish, St. John the Baptist in Harrison, did I notice in the picture that the pews were on a ramp, essentially,
They
elevated
are.
and going down?
And I have to tell you, let me see if we can find that picture. Wait a minute, is this?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's a slight ramp, and I was very much against a ramp. And the architect said, we're going to go visit churches he's done. And he says, the benefit of that slight ramp is that people in the back can see better. And I was like, well, okay. And when we went to visit the churches, it made a difference. Part of the reason I was against ramps is because I've been in churches where they're almost like theater ramps, you know, and you couldn't kneel because so we have kneelers and all of that, and it works well. And so as a person who had been against it and, you know, didn't want it, I was glad we did it, you know.
Go ahead. Does Built on Living Stones have recommendations one way or the other with that, or that's completely
That's up to you. Now, the other thing that we actually did was take a wheelchair and have someone in a wheelchair and push them up and down an aisle at a church before we built ours. And we found that that slope was not a problem for, you know, a senior citizen to push another senior citizen. It wasn't a problem. So if you do a ramp, you want to be very careful that it's gradual. The other thing you have to remember if you do a ramp, that you cannot easily just add on pews. You know, it's going to be spaced, and those pews would not have just the flat right angle at the bottom. It's going to be, so those are things that your architect should be taking care of all that. But what I found is with very good architects too. They're human, and so you don't hesitate to raise a question and say, if we have this, how are you taking care of this or that? Another thing, while we're on just mentioning pews, this tells you how my mind works, but on the kneelers, one of the things, a guy on the committee, we got the kneelers in, and the kneelers, when you lifted them, actually hit the wood of the back of the pew. And he one time snapped his thumb and didn't snap it off, but snapped his thumb with that. And he said, so the church was finished, and he says, I will pay to realign all of these pews so that it doesn't happen, or I won't complete my pledge. And his pledge was quite significant. And he himself and 4 other people went to all the pews, every kneeler, and moved them down. But you want to tell the guy, we want finger clearance there, because that can also be a lawsuit, but and so that awareness. The other thing, and I don't know if this is normal, if they did it, when you built your church in Florida, did they bring in sample pews for people to try?
Fire marshal said that you had to have self-rising kneelers.
They had to what?
Self-rising
kneelers. Oh, really?
Kneelers,
Yeah. No,
but we were able. That's why sometimes if you see a long church that has a section of back, because they can only be so long a pew for fire code before you have to have self-rising kneelers.
Yeah. That accounts for why we have them. I thought we had them just for people to be. But when we get to the back of ours, there's a space. And yeah.
And it makes a difference to get a good pew that fits well, but also kneel-wise if you're a tall person or those kind of things. So those are things that we'd want to check out very clearly. Yeah.
The other thing is you look much more fit than. I always said about us, including myself and Harrison, we were a big-boned people. And the kneelers were like made for people who were from a famine. I mean, you're just right up against them. So if you have something in front of you, you're sort of pushed back. So those are all things you want to consider. The other thing is when they describe size of pews, you can measure pews. Like they'll say, this is how many people you can have in. They determine how many people you can fit by shoulder width. And I think it's 18, 21, or 24 inch. Well, I don't know many adults who have an 18-inch shoulder. Now, you've got to figure you're also including kids in that mix. But to say there's places that build churches saying, yeah, we thought we'd save money by saying it's 18-inch shoulders, and we hold 600 people, and they find they hold 520 because people are bigger. So just those are kind of things to look at. And your architect should bring them up to you with that.
I got it.
Oh, sure.
You answered the question. I thought with the decline for elderly people, sometimes it's not so good.
Right.
But we talked about the baptismal fount and how the water stays clean, or do you empty it, or?
Yes. If you have I'm going to use the term baptismal pool, but even a baptismal font, it can be easier to deal with that. Anything you have, it should be able to be drained into what we call a sacrarium. A sacrarium is a hole in the ground that is not connected to a sewer system. And so the water goes in there, it's consecrated water, goes in there. You have that in the sacristy now. All sacristies have that special thing. So today you can get filtration systems and all of that. At St. John's, I thought I'll get the Knights of Columbus to pay for the font, and there was a guy there who told me when I came there, I said, well, what do you do? And he says, I take care of pools. And I thought, how do you take care of pools in Cincinnati and make a living off of that? And then I saw his house. Here he designed pools for country clubs and maintained their systems. And he came up with a system. And so I think it could be worth saying, I'm going to look at this. It has not leaked, which can often be a problem. And it filters the water to, it's smaller than, so the filter would catch something the size of blood cell. And it has ultraviolet light that it goes through, so we don't have to put anything in the water. Once a year for Holy Week, we change the water, and it was never a problem. And so I think if you say you want to go that way, I would call St. Columba's and ask for the plans. Unfortunately, the guy died who designed it, but it was, I mean, other parishes have said, well, we've had trouble with leaking or with this or that. But yeah, you don't have to do that. Now, if you don't have a baptismal pool and you have a font, it might be just as easy to empty the water and put new water in, you know. But you want to have those things built in and not be there with a 5-gallon bucket trying to drain this and haul it back and forth. Does that answer that? Anything else?
Yeah, one of the things that I noticed wasn't mentioned is the idea of a crying room for the babies. We've got 2 of them here.
You know, I think a crying room is just not in the documents at all, because that's considered to be something a place would take care of. And there's people who say, no, you should not have a cry room, and people who say, well, if you want to hear something at Mass, you need a place to go. And ideally, I would say there is no cry room, but we don't live in an ideal world. Now, we do live in a parish, and so you're going to have the noise of children in a parish. You know, when people say, I don't want any noise, well, then you want to go be a monk, you know. But a place, you know, you can't control a kid. I mean, you know, you think you're the parent, but you can't always. So to have a place for them to go, and a number of options would be to have a room where they could go, where people could still see and they can hear in that. Or St. Columban in Loveland had it where the gathering area, and that's another thing we didn't have a chance to talk about, but the gathering area is big enough that there's 2 sets of St. Margaret of York, no, St. Susanna's has it too. There's 2 sets of rows of chairs. They don't have pews back there because then you can rearrange it. And that's the cry room. You go back there, you know, and that. And so that is, I think that's a good point that you brought up that I just didn't think of with the document, but, you know. Yes?
Similar to the cry room, the gathering area outside the church.
Yeah.
Is there really any guidelines as far as what they would, do they size, what they,
no
guidance there?
No, there should be a place big enough for people to gather. It doesn't have to be huge, but most of our what we call vestibules would not be adequate for that. It's good to have a place where people can gather. I've noticed in a number of churches, there's like a desk or like a welcome stand where people can take care of different things, register for the parish, find out about this or that. And that seems to be very helpful for people. It's a place where they can display things at St. Susanna's in Mason. It's a very international, use the word international parish. I mean, there are people from all over because there's 2 huge P&G places and I think a GE place close by. So it is like very cosmopolitan. And so there are places right now. There was a big display up for Our Lady of Guadalupe. Another time there's a big Korean feast that they would celebrate. And so there were places for people to have coffee and donuts and that. The trick is making sure that it stays clean and doesn't gather things up. But I think what you can realize is the farther people have to walk to go to something when they leave church, you're going to have a drop-off of people. If you say, well, we got a building over here, and they have to walk even 200 feet, it's closer to their car. So those are just things to consider with that and looking at that. But there's no explicit thing. That can also be used for visitations for funerals if you do that, you know, instead of having it at a funeral home and church. Personally, I think that a funeral home has a value that isn't found in having a visitation in the back of church or in the gathering area. That's my own opinion. But it works especially well when you have an older person who has just a few family members and that. So whatever you want to do, I mean, with that. But it's mentioned in there, but it doesn't say you have to specifically have this or that, Anything else? I think we're over time. Thank you all. If I can be any further, I hope I've been helpful, and if I can be any further help, let me know. And I'm praying for you, and I hope that, I don't think it'd be likely you'll have a new church by Christmas of 26, but I'm praying you're in it and used to it by Christmas of 27. So God bless you all, and keep the faith and keep the charity and keep the zeal and trust in God. Why don't we close with the glory be? Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. Let us go in peace. Thanks be to God. Thank you all. Good to be with you.